I am Tyler C. Milner, pastor and one of the many promoters of the life and works of Dr. King. And it is my honor to welcome you this evening to the third annual MLK Beloved Community Symposium, Strengthening the Black Community. Where do we go from here? We are here to engage in reflection and conversation and to hear proposals for change, which should lead us closer to the beloved community. To be active in moving in this direction will require difficult dialogue and mutual conversation between diverse groups. If we are committed to this goal, it requires a diverse panel, which the foundation has assembled for your education this evening. The challenge to you and me as consumers of these great ideas is to hear out the full conversation while reserving judgment, holding our peace until all have spoken. Whether you or I agree with one point and oppose another point, that's okay. Permit yourself to be both inspired and enlightened by the tension brought on by the sparks and the light of competing ideas and competing strategies. Now is the time to have this difficult conversation. I believe in the beloved community is possible and is worthwhile to work at it. The beloved community is not just for me and my friends, it is for all, and everyone has a responsibility to participate and share the responsibility, while at the same time experiencing some pain and some agony. In other words, a rigorous and invested conversation obviously will have some sparks and at the same time some pushback. But hear what King said: human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertion and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. I believe the pound is such a group. Considering what happened in Washington on January the 6th, our nation, or should I say, our democracy was assaulted and to a degree torn. You and we must have this difficult conversation now. Again, I say welcome, sit back, and enjoy the evening.
I thank all of you who are attending our third annual symposium on strengthening the Black community and where do we go from here. We have some exciting presenters this evening. And we have as our second moderator, I'm one, and we have Dr. Sean Yutzi here to my right, who is one of the moderators also. And we're going to start the evening off. I do believe I see Dr. Ronna Forbes.
Hello there.
You are there?
I'm so happy to be here.
All right. What we're going to do, rather than start with the questions and answers, I want all the presenters on the panel to introduce themselves. Just take about maybe 1.5 minutes to say who you are, the organization you are affiliated with, and a little bit of something about your background.
Well, sure. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Travers. It's really an honor to be here and to take part in this seminar, symposium. And it's really something for me that it's a continuation of our celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. and what he did to contribute to our community, to make our community, and to talk about service. I mean, my day of service is turned into a week of services and 2 more weeks of services. So I'm so happy to be here to be a part of that. I'm a physician. I'm a physician psychiatrist. I came to Richmond, Virginia in 1980 when I started working at Medical College of Virginia, VCU. I was the director of a substance abuse program, an inpatient substance abuse program. After a few years, I worked in community psychiatry for the rest of my career. And community psychiatry for me is that I worked in a number of the mental health clinics around town, the Richmond Mental Health and Henrico Mental Health and Hanover Mental Health, did some training in District 19 in Petersburg. And so my field has always been community psychiatry. I go wherever my clients are. I worked for a while for the Department of Mental Health, Department of Mental Health, Mental Retardation and Substance Abuse Services as medical director. And one of the thoughts that I have there is that some of you met me then. It was on the 13th floor in the Madison building downtown. And from there, you could see all across the state, and figuratively, you could see all of the problems across the state, but also most of the time, there wasn't a whole lot you can do about it. And so I was always glad to get back down on the ground. The last part of my career, I worked at Central State Hospital as medical director. And Central State is a hospital in Petersburg where there's the only maximum security forensic program. So I dealt with people who were involved in the criminal justice system, and also the patients from Richmond, Central Virginia, who had crisis situations that couldn't be managed in Richmond and would go to Central State. I retired a couple of years ago, but really retired to a life of volunteerism. I'm on the board. I'm the president of the board at Gateway Homes, which is a residential treatment program for people who are trying to find community. I'm on RI International, which is a national and international forum for people who are working on crisis management in a variety of places across the country and around the world. I'm still a friend of Central State, so I'm on the board of Friends of Central State and the board of One Voice, a chorus of Blacks and whites that get together and talk about justice through singing. And I'm also now working very hard on something that's, I'll talk about a little bit later, but 988, a new call across the state when people are in crisis, and we'll be able to get a single focus for response. So I'm a volunteer, and as a volunteer, I'm glad to be here with you tonight.
Dr. Renata Jones.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am Ellen Norman's baby girl. That's my mama. I'm here because of my mama. I do what I do because of my mama. And on the way, I currently am a core faculty member at Walden University. I'm a retired person from Richmond Public Schools after 30 years there. And I left the Department of Corrections after 15 years of service there and went to Richmond Public Schools. Education and social work is what I do, and it is what I love to do. My recent studies have been with reintegration after incarceration. I've been working last year, and we were supposed to be this year, but COVID saw better. I'm working with the International Conference of Incarcerated Parents, which is an international organization. And last year, in 2019, we were in London. This year, we were supposed to be in Canada. We didn't make that trip due to COVID, but we're making plans for an international conference that's to come up really soon. I believe we lose our families to incarceration. The entire family is incarcerated, the community is incarcerated, and it is our job as free people to help those people reintegrate after incarceration with normalcy in their lives and support. That is what I do. I was at VCU for 15 years as an adjunct faculty in social work. I was at Virginia State as adjunct faculty in social work, and I'm a policy person. I work with the Black Congressional Caucus on Capitol Hill for policies that are relevant to our communities across the nation. So I am so pleased to be here tonight with all of you, and I hope that we make an impact on our community.
Dr. Monica Monroe.
Can you hear me okay?
No.
Excellent. I am Dr. Monica Monroe. I'm currently the Department Chair of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Virginia Union University. I've been in Richmond, Virginia for 5 years now. I've resided in Florida before I relocated here. My area of research includes childhood trauma's impact on the left cerebral hemisphere of the brain as it relates to the Black college students' lack of academic success in math and language arts. The reason I am choosing to pursue this type of research is because of the amount of trauma that is in the Black community, but a lot of times that trauma goes unnoticed, or it's unannounced, or simply it's not thought of as trauma at all. So a lot of our children, unfortunately, are dealing with a lot of adult chaos in their small minds, and then we're expecting these small children to act accordingly in various environments when they simply cannot do so. And what I'm trying to show is the reason they can't is because different parts of their brain is definitely being impacted. But as we talk about the various types of trauma, nobody really sits around and talk about the parts of the brain such as the corpus callosum or the amygdala. No one talks about that, right? And a part of my research included creating a course in the department where I'm the chair called Childhood Trauma and Adult Criminality, a Black Perspective. I created that course again because I've attended a lot of conferences that talked about the various trauma types, but there are other trauma types that Black children go through, and their trauma, their pain deserves to be discussed as well. Once we start discussing those traumas, then perhaps we'll start talking about solutions. And as we know, a lot of our trauma end up being criminal activity, which also leads to mass incarceration. Again, I am Dr. Monroe, and it is such a pleasure to join all of you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think I see Stephanie Ritzy.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Wow, with this panel of esteemed guests. Thank you so much for having me. Again, like I said, my name is Stephanie Rizzi. My grandmother is a native Richmonder. My parents grew up in Richmond, and I was born at the Medical College of Virginia, which is now VCU Medical Center. I have been an educator for 28 years. I have taught at the K-12 level for 11. And the entire time I also served as an adjunct instructor in the Department of English at VCU. I have been teaching focused inquiry now at Virginia Commonwealth University for 12 years. I'm a direct advocacy person. I kind of am an on the ground person. I've participated in marches that took place this past summer. I've done advocacy with several organizations in the city, including my participation with the Richmond Crusade for Voters. I've done some work with Richmond for All with organizing. I've also worked with the Richmond Transparency and Accountability Project. I've done some work with Ms. Slater here through Rise for Youth. I have many former students who are now involved in the Richmond advocacy community. And I just am kind of a get in where I fit in person. Whatever I can do to fight for the rights of my people, I am going to do to the best and the limits of my ability. And when I say my people, I talk about working class and poor Richmonders who largely have been rendered voiceless in this city. And so I'm really happy to be here, and hopefully I can make a contribution that will then lead to some proactive, productive change. Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie Slater, is Valerie here yet?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Oh,
so
hey
much.
there. How are you
Hey,
doing?
I am doing very well. So glad to see you and to be a part of this esteemed panel. I tell you what, just listening to everyone that has already spoken before me, I am honored to be amongst the panelists with such an esteemed group of individuals. Yes, my name is Valerie Slater. I'm the executive director of Rise for Youth. Rise stands for Reinvest in Supportive Environments. I'm also an attorney. I began my practice at the Disability Law Center of Virginia, working in the Children's Advocacy Unit, advocating for the rights of children with disabilities in all of the different environments that they find themselves, from the schoolroom to particular placements that they may find themselves in, to include Beaumont and Bonaire juvenile correctional centers, which are the youth prisons here. Beaumont's closed, but in Bonaire Juvenile Correctional Center, the youth prison. I transitioned from there to being a coordinator of Rise for Youth and a juvenile justice attorney with the Legal Aid Justice Center. And from there, was fortunate enough to take Rise for Youth independent. And so I graduated, if you will, to executive director. And we continue to go strong, advocating for the rights of children. Juvenile justice attorney all day, every day, fighting for the rights of children. It is my life's work. It is what I am passionate about. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole, because I tell you what, I start talking about the work and I want to just go deeper. But I tell you, I'm also the mother of beautiful daughters. I have a daughter who has been diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and she is a thriving and beautiful young woman. And yes, I have fought the fight to make sure that she could make it to that place. I'm the daughter of another beautiful young daughter. Well, she's married, so she's my youngest, but nevertheless, she's married, and I have 3 beautiful granddaughters, and I continue to fight. I'm just sharing one quick little story. When we first moved here to Virginia, we're from Seattle. We first moved here, my daughters were in high school, and my younger daughter, she posted a picture of herself on Facebook. And some little boy said to her, "Oh my goodness, what a beautiful princess." And a non-melanated young girl said to her, "Don't be stupid. Only white girls can be princesses." And so I fight every day to remind every Black girl that she is a princess and that she is on her way to becoming a queen. And you know what? We will fight together. I promise this conversation tonight, it's going to be soul stirring. And once your soul is stirred, let that lead you to action. And so thank you again for having me. And yeah, Valerie Slater, glad to be here.
Thank you, Valerie. Is Daryl Hayat?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so
All right.
much, Ms. Travers, for having me. I'm Daryl Hayat. I'm a housing attorney with the Virginia Poverty Law Center. I'm also a legal fellow with the Housing Justice Project of Equal Justice Works. So at Virginia Poverty Law Center, I address the legal needs of the Central Virginia residents. We offer legal representation and education. I work with legislators to change laws and enact laws to help with the eviction crisis that was going on in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That was even prior to COVID. I also have organized a wide variety of Know Your Rights presentations and seminars and education activities for tenants in Virginia, especially in Richmond. And we've also done some tenant town halls. We also work with Virginia Union's workforce management program. Shout out to Dr. Cosby and Georgia Bello and Nick Nix and everybody there. We work with some of the students there who also went up to Capitol Hill with us last year, prior to COVID, to help, lobby for some new laws to help out tenants. I work with landlords and tenants, both public and private housing. As a consultant, graduated from T.C. Williams High School in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm originally from Queens, New York City, but I moved to Virginia in high school. Shout out to Mr. Diggins. I'm sure he's on his line watching me. And then I went to Virginia Union. I'm a graduate of Virginia Union, graduated in 2006. And then I went to Regent University School of Law in Virginia Beach, and I came back up to Richmond mainly because I have a bunch of college friends here. I loved when I was in Virginia Union, so I was, really excited to try to help the city. And that's it from me. I hope that, I'm able to add something, some value to the discussion. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Dr. Sean Yutzi, you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Bernice. I'm sitting here trying to realize that I'm on camera and minding my manners because I'm very fidgety. But my name is Sean Yutzi, and I'm a professor of psychology and chair of African American Studies at VCU. And I'm very delighted to be facilitating this discussion with Bernice. I think it's going to be a very lively discussion. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Bernice.
You're welcome. Okay, we're going to start off with Dr. Ronna Forbes. Dr. Forbes, your first question. Your background is in race-related stress and depression, and how this race-related stress impact the well-being of the African American community.
Mhm.
Would you explain to us how race-related stress, the degree that it impacted the community prior to COVID and now after COVID?
Wow. Yeah, certainly, certainly. You know, I guess first I would think together with all of us who have been working with children and adults in the Black community. Let's think, and working in ourselves, let's think some about stress. Stress is the body's response to threat. And we as a people in this phase of our lives live under a variety of different threats. As you talked about the brain, Ms. Monroe, Dr. Monroe, you talked about the different parts of the brain. Stress causes our hypothalamus to respond. It's our body's response. And when it responds, there are changes all through the body. Heart rate is up, the adrenal gland put out hormones, breathing goes up, our muscles are tense. You know, we get into a position of, at a small level, of either fighting our way out of this threat or fleeing, running away from it, fight or flight. And so we as a people have lived under a variety of different kinds of stress through the years. And so it's no surprise that there are consequences. You know, it's one thing to live under a short period of stress, but we're not supposed to live under chronic stress. And in our community in times we are. And that chronic stress leads to heart disease and hypertension and obesity and changes with our sleep, our mood, anxiety, depression, all of these are problems. So it's a perfect storm to think about living under chronic stress and COVID-19, because COVID-19 affects even more those who are obese, those whose nutritional status is not good, those whose immune status is not good, those who don't get enough rest, those who are separated from friends and family. And so in many ways, it's almost like, even though the president talked about the virus coming from someplace else, it seems like it was pointed at my community. And so it's no surprise that we're 12, 13% of the population, but 25, 30% of the deaths, that we continue to be higher in terms of hospitalizations, and we continue, so that COVID-19 preferentially appears to affect the African-American population. It's not only in the physical ways, but also in mental ways. You know, in terms of, I talked about anxiety and depression and suicidality. All of these are consequences of chronic stress. And COVID-19, it's been shown, Johns Hopkins did a study that showed even back in April, May, June, at the early parts of the pandemic, suicide attempts and suicide thoughts were much higher in the African-American community. And as the pandemic continues, mental health clinics, Richmond and Henrico, mental health clinics are telling me that people are calling for help, asking for help, needing help because of the chronicity of it all. So it's not a new problem. I mean, I think that we have lived under pandemic conditions for years, but we really find ourselves now having this combination of stress, chronic stress, the body's response, our responses, and now having to deal with the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Forbes. I want to ask a follow-up question. Can you distinguish between the kind of obvious stressors around race and racism and those kind of microaggressions, things we hardly notice? And are those as stressful as the big things, like being called the N-word, being followed or harassed by the police? Which is more important, the big stresses or the small, tiny microaggressions?
I will let you stand for VCU, okay? And so I finally get to get something off my chest. I came to VCU in the 80s, 81, 82, 83. If me and 2 or 3 of my colleagues walking from Broad Street into the hospital, my white colleagues would go to the elevator and security would ask for my ID. Hey, what's up with that? If in the old days, in the mid 80s, if I would go downtown to Tallheimer's, I got to know some of the security people, you know, the plainclothes security people. I got to know them because they would kind of follow me around. I think that living in those conditions does, in fact, microaggressions does, in fact, add to hypertension, does, in fact, add, we only have a certain number of beats in our lives, and a few extra beats are dealing with that. A recent study in Chicago where they did a survey of people who acknowledged microaggressions. And in fact, 3,000 people were questioned, in fact, had more hypertension, had more obesity, had more anxiety, had more sleep disturbance. So over and over and over again, these microaggressions take their toll on the body. Everybody in the world, if you can, talks about going on vacation, and vacation is by definition going somewhere where there are none of these aggressions. We know what that feels like, but then also walking down the street in Broad Street or walking through the schools of Richmond or trying to get care in Richmond, those lower levels of aggression take their toll. And so it's not only the large outright aggressive situations that we have to deal with, but every day when you live in my community, we have to deal with that, and it has its consequences.
Thank you for that. One more quick point on that. Does it matter how we deal with them in terms of escalating the stress or buffering the stress?
We do have to deal. And the dealing, I mean, there, just like there are big aggressions, there are also big treatments, but it really is the small ones. We've got to learn to I mean, in terms of stress and the response, to rest, to eat right, to build up our nutrition system, to maintain our relationships, even during this time of social distancing, whether it's telephone or Zooming with family and friends, trying to get back to institutions. Institutions help to add to our resilience. It's really been shown, a recent study by a doctor at Duke looked at the place that church holds in our communities, that those that are regularly participating in church and religion have less anxiety, have less depression. And so that we have to look at the low-tech ways that we all can. And so a lot of it is taking care of self, forming relationships and maintaining relationships, dealing with institutions, and trying to take care of your nutrition, your weight, your rest, your digest, all of those that counter the tolls of stress.
Thank you, Dr. Forbes.
Okay, Dr. Forbes, I have one question also. Does race-related stress increases substance abuse in the Black community among young Black men and women?
For sure. If you look at groups that are under, and I mean communities and large groups that are under stress when they've been surveyed, those who have less stress or those who have more supports use less first, not even talking about disease, but use less tobacco, alcohol, other drugs. And then those who have tried drugs and are under chronic stress through the years, I bet Dr. Monroe is going to be telling us more about children who have lived in our school systems in our communities are more susceptible to substance use and substance abuse and chronic substance abuse. And so managing stress also helps people who have problems to get involved with care. Those who are under stress are less likely to seek and accept treatment and have resilience enough to be able to go through it. So stress certainly affects substance use as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to ask a question of Daryl Hayart about housing.
Yes, ma'am.
You've been assisting Blacks with evictions and homelessness problems.
Yes, ma'am.
We have been having homelessness problems for quite a while. Has this problem increased now with the pandemic of COVID? Although it has been a pandemic before COVID, could you sort of elaborate and talk about the homelessness and the housing and how the effects that it's having now on the Black community?
Sure. You know, everything that, you know, any kind of pandemic, any kind of, you know, disruption and the economic flow, you know, in America, whether it be a recession or depression, anything, it affects, you know, stuff like that rolls downhill. So it's always going to start somewhere and end up really hurting the people who can't afford to, to get out the way of that snowball and do anything like that. Same thing with COVID. I mean, the, COVID and evictions, they all, if you look at a map, and there are, maps available, if you were to look at a map and see the highest concentration of COVID infections versus the highest relation of household evictions, it's in the same place. And it's also in the same place where you have the highest number of Black people, highest number of Latin, brown people, whatever have you. It's just the way the system has been set up. It's been set up like since the 1930s, when the, the homeowners loan, corporation and the federal government, as a way to try to revitalize the economy, started to give out these 15-year loans as opposed to the 5-year loans to try to get some home ownership going. But they would only give them to the white people. They would have these restrictive covenants saying, we're not even going to give you these rates, unless you live in a neighborhood that has no Black people in it. I mean, it was federal law. You could put this into, say, I don't want Black people there. And as a result, you get what they call like redlining, where people were to look at a map and draw the places where the poor Black people were, where the Irish, Italian people were, and they would shade them in red, even if it had just Black people in it. It was just one of the criteria. They would shade it in red so people know not to go there, not to buy there, not to set up schools, banks, grocery stores there, because these were seen as threats, and that those laws have since been changed with the Fair Housing Acts in the 60s and things like that, but the lines were already drawn. It's kind of like what people are saying about Trump and trying to impeach him on his way out. Well, the damage was already done. You kind of should have thought about that prior to doing it. So now you have these lines, people could see these lines in the sands, and it just stayed there. Banks have fled from Black neighborhoods, high education systems fled from the Black neighborhoods, leaving people in despair, not even, and, real estate is so vital to, Americans' success of all colors that, Black people were just shut out from that. So they just stayed in these kind of quarterized places. And when stuff happens like that, all of the resources seem to miss these places. You know what I mean? Things like rent relief, things like health relief, all these things seem to miss these places. So it's the same as back, I don't really think that things have changed so much. Wait, I don't see a big change. I mean, I know that, people are still marching, people are still being shot and killed, and it's the same situation. So, back to, your question, yeah, homelessness has been exacerbated by the number of evictions that were going on. COVID infections really hurt those that are outside and, and in the common areas. So you'll be infected. It's just, one thing leading to another and leading to another. But it all really starts with people have to lose. I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that, these were lines that were placed in place by the federal government. And then they backed out saying that, hey, well, real estate is private. So we're going to back out of it, unless you're taking, federal, subsidies, then it's not our business. It's not our business. And so they set the rules up and then they backed out the game and just left private citizens here without any kind of federal oversight. So the private citizens who like those lines want to keep those lines. They don't want you in your neighborhood. They don't want to give you the resources. They don't want to give you the banks. They want to keep it going because it was profitable for them and it helps them keep you out of line. So it's just the same thing over and over again.
Excuse me. We have a question for, it has to come back. Okay.
Okay.
Dr. Yusi.
Yes. The follow-up question that I have for you, Kevin, is related to I'm sorry, Darryl. The obvious things about evictions and homelessness is that you're without a home. What can you tell us, for those of us who are not in the know, what kind of other trickle-down effects it has on individuals and families, being evicted, being homeless? What are the ramifications of those situations?
it's life or death. I mean, no, you can't. I mean, shelter is primary to just being a human being. Being a human being. I mean, it's the weather. The weather is cold outside right now. Somebody poor right now. 34 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Humans ain't supposed to be in that. That's why they had shelters and people lived in caves and all that stuff. Fire was invented. All that stuff was to protect human beings against the elements, because the elements were too strong for human beings to survive on their own. So that's why shelter was it just was a thing. So without shelter, you risk having COVID or having hypothermia, having the flu. The flu will still kill you. Okay. And then, or you can get mugged, you can get robbed, you can get with all these outside elements that put you in these are desperate people that desperately need to be shelter is just this water. You need shelter, you need food. So, you force people into homelessness, you're taking away one of the fundamental things that are keeping them alive. And people seem to, I don't know when, like shelter became like a commodity. Like, it's everybody should be in a place somewhere. That's just the basics. If you can't do that, then maybe you shouldn't be running a government.
Thank you. And also, I wanted to also have you speak to, it seems to me that people who are working, who have children in school, that their lives, their employment is affected. The children's educational opportunities are affected by that disruption.
Yeah, I mean, it's survival. When you turn situations into survival, into fight or flight, everything changes in their lives. I'm from Queens. I was in the projects, and I didn't think about real estate. I didn't think about savings accounts. I didn't think about anything else except for week to week, making sure that I don't see my mother crying all the time because she's blaming herself for all this stuff that has nothing to do with her. It's all about that. You're so preoccupied with the tears that you see, with the hardships that you see, you being cold, you being hungry, you seeing on the TV that there's this American dream that's been afforded to everybody but people that look like you. I mean, they talk about the trauma, they talk about, of course, goes without saying, and it just changes everything. There are people who never think about where the next meal's coming from, never think about shelter, never think about any of these things. So their mind is free to enjoy things like, building their character, building on their goals and dreams and ambitions, building on their creativity, right? So if I give you these Legos and you're on this hardwood floor, and I tell you to build as tall as you can build as tall as you can, because if they fall, they're going to be falling on the wood. You just pick them back up and build again. But being poor and being in this situation, it's like trying to build that same construct, but in water, right? I'm asking you to build it in water. You may have one time, and you better build it right, right? And that's where we're first. We have to do things right the first time, And while we're trying to careen and walk and maneuver around the system so that we don't break any laws, we're going to march silently and quietly, and just like, Martin did. We shall overcome, nonviolent, but the other people could swing into the Capitol on a chandelier like Zorro. But we couldn't do that. We still try to stay within the law. So it's still two different sets of, it's just, what do you tell somebody? When one set of laws just doesn't apply to those people based on pigmentation? Oh no.
Thank you.
No problem. No problem, sir.
Thank you. Stephanie Ritzy. We want to talk about education. Question. What are some of the primary educational challenges that Black children in Richmond, especially those going to maybe RPS, are faced with? What were they faced with prior to the pandemic? And what type of problems and issues, excuse me, are confronting them after the pandemic?
All right.
And has the pandemic really magnified some of these problems?
Thanks for that question, Ms. Travers. I really appreciate it. I want to start by just recognizing something that we don't always clearly admit, which is that institutional racism and that limits the opportunities of African Americans and other people of color in every aspect of society, which includes, employment, housing, healthcare, and education. They're all intertwined, right? It's hard to separate out education from the housing piece that, Daryl just so eloquently spoke about, right? And we have all of those issues going on right now in Richmond. Richmond, in fact, I think is like a Petri dish kind of battleground for like all of these issues where the Black community is concerned. And I think that the results of this discrimination have been really clear during this time of COVID-19, which has very much disproportionately affected the Black community here. And we've seen issues with unemployment rate, our mortality rates in the Black community are higher, housing, food instability, and the digital divide. And, that's something that I definitely want to focus on because, it existed pre-COVID. It has been exacerbated since COVID. Even students who now have access to laptops don't always have access to, stable Wi-Fi. Actually, we've heard specific stories about children who live in our public housing communities not having Wi-Fi, even though they have hotspots, they don't particularly work in the public housing units. But then that digital divide existed beforehand. These kids have just been handed a laptop like here. Now, the divide is over. You have a laptop. Well, a lot of kids who have had access to resources already know how to use those laptops. And their parents are more sophisticated in terms of like controlling and managing what happens on laptops. I have a parent who just told me that she walked downstairs and her son was looking at pornography on an RPS, issued laptop. That shouldn't happen, but some parents don't know how to set parental controls. I mean, these are things, also, just helping students with logging in. It's second nature for someone who's resource rich. Someone who's never had a laptop in their household is going to struggle more. So some of that definitely has been exacerbated by the pandemic. We are full of people in Richmond who argue for school reform. And I'm less of a reformist than I am an abolitionist, right? And one of my mentors, her name is Barbara Smith. She was actually, really, really prominent in feminist movements. And she's retired now. She's in Albany, New York, and she's kind of been watching me and helping me out. But she sent me this book called An Uprising for Educational Justice, Black Lives Matter at School. It's edited by Denisha Jones and Jesse Hagopian. And I'm hoping I pronounced that right. The quote is, politicians who know the words justice and equity only when they want peace in the streets are going to try to persuade us that they are capable of reforming centuries of oppression by changing policies, adding more accountability measures, and removing the bad apples from among police. And here I want to add also schools. But reform is no longer enough. Too often, reform is rooted in whiteness because it appeases white liberals who need to see change but want to maintain their status, power, and supremacy. Abolitionists want to eliminate what is oppressive, not reform it, eliminate it. Not reimagine it, but remove oppression by its roots. Abolitionists want to understand the conditions that normalize oppression and uproot those conditions too. Abolitionists, in the words of scholar and activist Bill Ayers, demand the impossible and work to build a world rooted in the possibilities of justice. Abolitionists are not anarchists. As we eliminate these systems, we want to build conditions that create institutions that are just, loving, equitable, and that center Black lives. Abolitionism is not social justice. It is a way of life defined by commitment to working toward a humanity where no one is disposable. Prisons no longer exist. Being Black is not a crime, and teachers have high expectations for Black and brown children, and joy is seen as a foundation of learning. And these are the words from Professor Bettina Love. So, we need to totally recreate this system. We can't reform it. We've got to do things that are going to completely change the way education works for Black children, including in the city of Richmond, because currently we're still dealing with the same issues. You know, our graduation rate is not exceptional. We're sitting at around 72%. The school that is in my district, that is pretty much 97% Black, you know, comprised of Black students and Latinx students. 57% of those students graduated in 2019, and 62% of Latinx students actually dropped out of school that year. So those numbers aren't exemplary, and they haven't changed since the pandemic. And you know, we need to really think about how we're delivering our education to our communities, how we can change. You know, I've heard anecdotal research, and I've actually done national research on how Black teachers are leaving the system, being pushed out in some cases. Our workforce, our teacher workforce is largely not Black and very young. And we also have to think about, like, you know, how representation matters in our classrooms, and what can we do to attract and keep more Black educators of color. So those are some of the issues I'm really concerned with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Mhm.
I want to ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
And then we're going to go back to some audience questions after you respond to the follow-up question. If you had to pick one single issue, and I know it is very difficult to do that, but if you had a magic wand and had to identify one single issue as the most crucial issue that should be declared a national emergency with regard to education of Black and brown children, what would you identify that issue as?
No, that's a great question. I would identify it perhaps as, you know, the fact that, you know, our kids are largely leaving our educational institutions unprepared to follow their dreams. They're being locked out of their dreams because of a lack of quality education. I had a student I taught, she was a very bright student. I taught her in 5th grade. She graduated from a Richmond public school, and I met her just last summer. She's in her 20s now. And she said to me, well, you know, the best I could do with where I went to school is graduate. And that is a reality for many Black children. When they are not properly educated, they are not prepared for the world, and it is not their fault. Our educational system fails them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's a question from the audience. It's for you. And it's so apropos, given your recent election to the school board. But it says, how can we get those African-American elected officials to be more persistent with pushing legislation that could change the narrative in the Black community, including education, of course?
You know, my answer to that is we can't necessarily always trust that the politicians will be motivated to do it without pressure from the Black community. And I think the hardest thing that I've had to deal with since I've become an elected official is the fact that I have a hard time reaching my people. You know, I hear voices all the time. You know, I get voices from the strongest, the loudest, the richest, the most, you know, privileged. But I have a hard time hearing the true stories, and I have to go out and actively find them, the true stories of the people who are actually struggling in this city. And so if I had a dream, if that dream could ever come true, it would be that our communities would wake up and stand up for what they deserve and fight and take time to listen to people who have a counter narrative other than what, you know, they're being told. Like really act to, you know, find the truth, because there's so many people out here telling our community so many things that aren't true. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know that we can count on the public officials to do it. We need the community to hold those people accountable.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to go back for a second to Darryl. There was a question that was posed with regard to what laws and policies should communities of color begin to address in terms of the issues of homelessness, evictions. Are there particular laws or policies we should be watching out for, we should be lobbying for, that might be helpful in terms of the evictions that are going on now, particularly during COVID?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely want to push for like an extension on the eviction moratorium. That's when the CDC, Center of Disease Control, put a federal moratorium in place saying that nobody could be kicked out of their house or evicted. They could still file for evictions, but they can't actually execute any evictions until January 31st. They were talking about extending it to March, under Biden, and that the CDC will come up with a more comprehensive package. We're waiting to see what that looks like. So, lobbying for that. Locally, there are a lot. It's a lot of laws. It's a lot of. See, the thing about it is when you lobby for these laws, you're going to get this pushback, and by the time the law comes out, it may be piecemeal of what you thought that it would be. So it's a very, the system is, hit or miss. You could, no matter how, but you have to show people that you care about your housing law, that that you are supposed to have these rights and that you care about these rights. Number two, you have to get educated on housing law, because there are a lot of laws. I really can't, except for the moratorium, which is the most pressing thing, because that keeps people there. So keeping a statewide moratorium or federal moratorium as long as possible. Then, lobbying to try to get funding, a lot of funding coming in to help both tenants and landlords. People are going to have to invest in this state, invest in this country, big investment. Okay, it happens. You're going to have to do it. You're going to have to write checks and you're going to have to invest, lobbying for that. But other than that, consistently educating yourself about housing laws. And then secondly, ensuring that the elected officials are doing their job. The era of accountability has to start coming into place now, because no one's being held accountable for seemingly anything on a high level. They can just do what they want without kind of impunity. So you have to hold your elected officials accountable, hold your teachers accountable, and hold yourself accountable. And I think that would, everything will work itself out well with that.
Daryl, if there's anybody listening right now who's struggling or facing eviction or has questions, can they contact you?
Yeah, always. 804-401-6161. You can email me, Daryl, DARYL, at vplc.org. But if you're having something pinned, like if you're facing eviction right now, then you can call the legal aid hotline. There's a helpline, 1-866-NO-EVICT, 1-866-NOEVICT. However, that's put into the numbers. You would call that. That's an emergency line that people could help you if you're facing eviction. I'm more of a person that you may want to have some general questions for, but if you're really facing it, call the helpline, 1-866-NO-EVICT. Call your local legal aids, because that's why they're there, to help lower income people. So if you're facing call your local legal aids. There are tons of them all over the state. And I'll put all that in the chat. So
Thank you. And back to Stephanie. I think the work you're doing as an elected official is extremely important. I think we lose a lot more people, a lot more Black people or children in school than we do in the streets. And there's a question for you, Stephanie, about should we expect more action from the Department of Education, the Virginia Department of Education, regarding significant and impactful change and reform in education communities, for communities of color?
Yeah, absolutely. We should expect more. We need to have funding. They're working right now. There is a bill. Well, it's not a bill, it's actually an act. It's called the School Equity and Staffing Act. I don't know if any of you've heard of it. It is now running through the General Assembly. What it does is it codifies the standards of quality prescribed by the Virginia Board of Education and provides additional funding for high poverty school divisions through the Equity Fund. And what that will do is give schools that need more more resources to work with. In addition to everything else that's going on in our schools actually do need to be fully funded, and those schools that need more money. And so that's one area that we can definitely put pressure on elected officials and on the Virginia Department of Education to support.
And the last question related to funding. Would you advocate for more school funding in RPS that Black and Brown children can experience more arts and culture exhibits beyond field trips, by the way of field trips? Their white counterparts get to experience tangible entities and vacations that they can apply to SOLs, where our children don't get out of the neighborhoods.
So certainly funding of that kind would be important, though I don't think it would solve any issues if they go on those vacations or visit those places and then graduate and can't get jobs or get into college. And so, yeah, experiential learning is really important. And we want to support that and fund it. But for me, ultimately, if those things don't lead to us doing better in society, having more opportunities in society, if we don't break down some of the systemic barriers to our children's success, those kinds of things are nice. They're icing on the cake. Well, if there is a cake, I mean, they're more like icing. But they don't necessarily change what I'd like to see change, which is structural institutional racism in our educational system.
Thank you very much. All right, Bernice.
Oh yeah, I'm here.
Mm-hmm. The next speaker. Mm-hmm.
Valerie.
Yes.
Now, Valerie, I know about the hard work you're doing working with our children and trying to keep our children out of prison. And I really commend you for it. Can you describe what is going on with the school to prison pipeline? Can you talk about too, how many young Black kids that are right now in the juvenile justice system? And has COVID-19 sort of magnified the school to prison pipeline?
Thank you for that question, Ms. Bernice. And yes, so let me answer the last question first. Has the COVID pandemic impacted the lives of young people and enhanced the school to prison pipeline? And in other words, leading more Black and Brown children into incarceration? That answer is a resounding yes. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning. So the school to prison pipeline, that is the policy and the procedures and the internal workings of a school system that leads children to either being pushed out of school or that ends them directly in the juvenile justice system, ends them in a court services unit because they have charges brought against them for childlike behavior. So Richmond Public Schools was embarrassed this last year over the numbers of young people who were brought into the system for nothing more than what they call it. They were brought in for disorderly conduct, which is one of those laws is basically a catch-all, meaning you kicked a can and it got on the nerves of the teacher, or it disrupted the classroom. You threw a noodle in the lunchroom and all of a sudden here you were finding yourself in trouble. You mouthed off to a teacher, you mouthed off to an administrator, you said no to a security officer. And so all of these seem like small things, and they are absolutely teenage, middle school behavior, right? Kids are going through that whole time in their lives where, number one, their hormones are raging and they're attempting to stand up on their own 2 feet and find their own way. And in Richmond, we're talking often about children who have been thrust into adult situations and leadership roles in their homes. And now here they are in a classroom where someone is demanding that they stop talking or stop tapping their pencil or stop leaning back and all of these things they're combating. We've heard so many powerful examples of the traumas that our young folks are experiencing, and those traumas are being experienced at an exponential rate in Richmond Public Schools. When we talk about the children that are coming from any of the courts, right? We talk about public housing, we're talking about the courts. So those kids are living in trauma. They're living in situations where they are fighting in flight, or they're either fighting or running from some very real issues. And then they come into a school that isn't understanding that situation that they are attempting to balance in their home life, in their street life, and sometimes even in their school life, because the trouble has followed them into the school. And so those children then find themselves hemmed up with juvenile justice system involvement. So while we are looking at, as it relates to children, 40% of all of the young people who end up in a court services unit, they've got a charge pending against them, a petition filed against them. Approximately 42%, those are Black children. 47% are white. But then when it comes down to who ends up in the deep end, oh wait, let's talk about diversion, because that's always an option, right? We can divert children in school who are needing assistance, who are needing support, right? Only between 20 and 30% of all of those petitions are actually diverted, while upwards of 80% are eligible for diversion, okay? So we got 42% of those kids that are Black, 47% are white, only between 20 and 30 are getting diverted, even though upwards of 80% are eligible. Now let's talk about who gets locked up. When we talk about the kids that are in the deepest end, we're talking about 68 to 70% are Black. So how did it go from 42 to 70, right? But then when we talk about the white kids that were at 47%, their number drops down to between 25 and 30. So do we have an issue? We already know that there is an issue, right? I mean, I may be telling you statistics that are outlining it and making it crystal clear, but I'm not making the case or informing anyone about an issue that we all already know exists. So what do we do about it? We have got to begin this process of dismantling this idea that our children are bad, that our children are somehow, more violent. That whole idea of a super predator that was introduced in the 70s, that was targeted at our children. It was our children that were going to grow up and be these violent, horrible gang members, right? And I mean, all of these lies were perpetuated so that we could continue this prison industrial complex. We got to continue to feed that pipeline. If we can look at a Black girl and say that she is more adult than her white counterpart, if we can say that she is just more violent in the way she speaks is aggressive, the way she carries herself is aggressive. She's not passionate, she's aggressive. If we can continue that narrative, or if we can dismantle the narrative, but the other side is saying we've got to keep that narrative going because that's how we're going to continue to criminalize these children. If we can say that the Black child, the Black male child, that they're aggressive and they're looking to be gang members and they're going to be carrying weapons and they're going to be attempting to sell drugs, if we can keep that narrative going, then we can continue to criminalize those children. Because let me tell you something else. The rate of children misbehaving, I'm going to call it misbehavior, because when it's a white child, they don't get criminalized. When it's a Black child, it's all of a sudden criminal. So that misbehavior, it's happening at the same rate and intensity on both sides. So it's not a matter of children from a particular community are just coming in and acting more aggressive, or the way they are acting is different in some way than the other child. That's not what it is. No, the intensity and the number of incidents, they are the same across, or very, very similar. But nevertheless, it is Black children that are being criminalized for their behaviors and then pushed either out of school. And we know when children aren't in school, they're going to be into something. School is a child's job. Just like we go to work and we do what we have to do, a child's work is going to school, learning and preparing themselves for the future. Or it's the school division that ought to be creating an environment that is conducive to them, understanding what their dreams are, being able to realize those dreams. And we're just not realizing that in Richmond or for Black children across the Commonwealth. So, yeah.
Thank you, Valerie. Stephanie would like to piggyback on some of your points or ask for clarification, Stephanie.
Yeah, Valerie, to your point, I just want to say, you know, I've been a teacher for a long time, close to 30 years. And I remember once a young white man threw a book at my head, a large literature book, while I was sitting in front of the room. And I sent that child to the office. He's an 11th grader now, so barely a child, almost an adult. And he came back the very next day. Years later, that child grew up and shot his parents. Because what? You know, he was ignored. They didn't deal with him. And so you're right. I mean, it's not like our children are more violent or more prone, you know, to criminality than any other child. It's just that they've been, you know, stereotyped and, you know, convinced. Some of our people believe it too, that our children are more violent and criminal than other types. So thank you for that testimony. I appreciate what you said.
You know, if I could just, Stephanie, I thank you for sharing that, because you bring up another point, right? So that young man, he was back in your class the next day. Can I tell you that often I am in conversation and in spaces with young people, Black and white, and where the Black child is telling me, I've been stopped by the police so often that I just can't even tell you the number. Not because they have done anything, not even because there was quote unquote probable cause for them to have been doing anything. They were just walking down the street while Black. I had one young man who we were literally setting up for one of our Know Your Rights trainings for young people at one of the community centers in one of the housing communities. He was just walking to the store during setup, was stopped in the alley by a police officer. And I mean, this is a young man who knew his rights and attempted to assert them. And that situation was escalating quickly. And but for an adult showing up and helping that situation de-escalate, that young man would have been arrested. Whereas the white children in the space were like, yeah, you know, I was doing this or that, and literally naming off their actual criminal behavior they were engaging in, the criminalized behavior that they were engaging in. And then talking about how the police officers that ever did get involved were just telling them, all right, don't do that again, and sending them on their way, or calling a parent to come and pick them up so that they didn't end up in any further trouble, or parents being called down to the station because it was a situation in which parents had to get involved, but in order to keep that white child out of the system, that parent was called so that they can come and pick them up. Yet our Black children can't even walk through an alley without getting stopped and saying, I think I smell weed, or you fit the description, or there have been break-ins in the neighborhood and you just happen to be in the area where those break-ins are happening. That's what's happening to our children. And so there is a pandemic that is happening. One of our esteemed panelists said that before. The pandemic has been here all along. It's been here. And so now it's just a pandemic that is affecting white folks, not at the same proportion, but nevertheless, we've had that pandemic of over policing, that pandemic of, you know, of racism, both the microaggressions and the macro, the overt. But nevertheless, our children, yes, they are living in fight or flight at constantly. And when they are just attempting to release just a little bit, they're being criminalized just for trying to live and breathe.
Thank you very much, Valerie.
We're going to go to Dr. Renata Jones. Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good.
I have a question, Dr. Jones. You have been working in the area of parental incarcerations for a long time and the demise that this has on the family. Can you sort of elaborate on how incarceration of a parent constitutes a pandemic in the Black community and in the Black homes?
So I am super glad that this is the topic for this evening and that we have pluralized pandemics. And again, the incarceration of parents, Black parents, is part of the pandemic. It's been consistent, it continues to grow, it gets worse, it festers. And we talk about Black families being dysfunctional. We talk about single moms. And when I have been a social worker for 45 years, and I'm just gonna put this plug in, I am the newly elected National Vice President for the National Association of Black Social Workers. Valerie, I was at Bonaire, I worked there, I worked at Barrett. You know, so I'm saying to all of you, you all join us because we have to unite as a front to advocate for our people. I've always been a sidebar mentee of Dr. Forbes, who used to work with the Black social workers years ago. So we have an issue here. And if you look at the history from Dr. Forbes down to the youngest person on this panel, the work continues to be done. We have accepted the fact that single parent has some diagnosis to it or sickness to it, some negativity. It does not. And when I said I'm here because of my mother, single mom, I have a doctorate. My 11th grade PE teacher told me my legs were big and pretty, so I was gonna have a lot of babies. Never lived in the projects. My mother worked all the time. So we build up our children in school to follow certain patterns because of the attitudes. So if your daddy or your mama is locked up, you don't have a life. You're not valuable. You shouldn't be smart. But the trauma, it's intergenerational slave syndrome. If you all read Joyce DeGruy, who talks about that, and our families are just put in a place of destruction, dysfunction by words. And so when our parents return home, if you have certain offenses, you can't live in public housing. Can't even do Section 8. So housing is where families need. Brother Darrell just said, having a home is part of being human. So you've already dehumanized that family. You've made them make a choice. No jobs. Now, I don't know if everyone knows, every department of social work, social services in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they have a reentry program. Their job is to work with all of those brothers and sisters that are coming and returning. They're not ex-convicts or ex-offenders, they're returning citizens. We criminalize them. Virginia is one of the few states who let that offender hang on people for the rest of their lives. Again, you begin to stereotype those families. So what my interest has always been is, first, probation and parole officers don't have to have any real mental health training to work with returning citizens. So part of what I've written is for them to use family group conferencing, which would begin in the institution and transition as they come and return to the community. And one thing we must remember, it is by design that you cut off their legs before they even learn how to walk. So our families are impacted, our children are impacted. In my research, one little boy said he really thought that he was going to visit his dad away at college. And so he started thinking he wanted to go live at a college like his daddy. That contributes to that school to prison pipeline because they have one thought in mind. We do nothing to take that myth away, to explain to them. One person said, her daughter said, when her father came home, said, well, you've been gone away to college long enough to have a college degree. You're a doctor and a lawyer. So then we lie to the children. We have to be truthful, and we have to work with systems to hire. Now, I had a Caucasian returning citizen say a few months ago that he was gonna get his CDL. My husband drove tractor trailers for 45 years. It is very hard for African-American men who are returning citizens to get their CDL to drive for many companies. And I was still trying to figure out how the younger white guy already had his CDL and a job with benefits, and the reverse happens. So part of my fight is to make sure we partner with corporations in the community, rental people who are gonna rent them homes, and you'd be surprised how many people are willing to work with you to get people back to, to collect these families and have them reunite and function and not write them off, because they are members of the community. And that's our job, to work with them. The children go to school. They're treated differently at school. And as a school social worker in Richmond City Public Schools, I remember having a meeting and giving my social history. And the teachers in the hall didn't know who I was at the time. I walked by, and the stuff that I read in my social history report, they were talking about it like general information. So I had to remind them that this was a violation of the law. And if they did not actually teach those children, they had no business talking about that situation because both of them could lose their jobs. So that's enough. I wrote in the chat, they need to be trained. Teachers need to be trained about confidentiality, HIPAA, FERPA. They need to be trained in terms of intervention so they can stop the things that go on in school. And they don't need to say, oh, his mama just got out of prison. She was a prostitute, a drug addict. All of those things we do to children, we do to families. If you go to social services in Richmond, the reentry program has a tag on the door, but there's not an employee in the room. Out of all of Virginia and all of the places I visited to do my research, I went to Charlottesville, Virginia. They have one of the most dynamic reentry programs in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The most dynamic. And so that is what we need to do when we talk about reintegration. Reintegration doesn't just mean the family. It means the community. It means society. It means functional. It means bring a paycheck home. It means gets benefits. I've worked with those families. They have houses for, Habitat for Humanity houses. They work. I collect the Black social workers. They come and do the community hours, and we need to do that again. But those are so many things that we can do when we are bringing families together. We need to go to school. I'm loving Valerie because I was the court liaison for Richmond Public Schools. So I know what goes to court and what doesn't go to court, or what should go. I don't even know if they replaced me since I retired. Nonetheless, you have to know the law so you can help people. And so when you know the law from the adult prison system through the juvenile prison system, the court system, and then you can be an advocate for people. And so we can't think the trauma is real. It's not a case of paranoia. And intergenerational trauma. Do you not know that every child that sees their face, they know there's a difference in the classroom? And I'm old enough that I experienced the light skin, dark skin thing. I've heard young people tell me that is still coming back. I thought it was gone. But we have to work with our families. We have to show them value. Being in prison doesn't make you be a headless monster. So that reintegration in the families, because a child whose parent is incarcerated loves their parent just as much as you love the parent who works every day. And we have to stop making distinctions between what is a parent. If you know and read research, children who are abused by their parents don't stop loving their parents. So these are things that we talk about and work with, and we've had very good success with reintegration with support systems. Okay, so that's where I am, and understanding trauma and how we support trauma rather than normalcy.
Okay, thank you, Renata. Appreciate those comments. Let me ask you one follow-up question before we go to our next panelist. And I want to be very clear that many times to the audience and everyone listening, that many times the answer we get is based on the question we asked. And so I don't want us to get bogged down in the idea, this notion that Black people are somehow innately dysfunctional and damaged. So I'm going to ask you a question that moves us in another direction. Because I know that most kids in the projects, most kids living in fixed income housing don't go to prison. Too many do, far too many do, but the majority don't. What have you seen, Renata, in terms of the strengths of those kids who manage, hook or crook, to keep the straight and narrow? Perhaps we can learn from them some things we can reinforce. What have you seen in those kids who have the same dire economic situation, but they somehow manage to graduate from high school and stay out of prison?
There's a big mama somewhere. And when I say that, I always look at the kids, and when a kid says to you, they don't say, yeah, uh-huh. They say, yes, ma'am. They say, ma'am. They say, yes. Somebody's talking to them. Somebody's raising them. They know how to speak back to you. When you say something, they know how to answer you. And some of those children, they live in the true community. They live in the neighborhood. And there's somebody in that neighborhood who is guiding them, who's talking to them, and who can give you their whole life history and nurturing them through. And I've seen those children, those are the parents or big mamas who come to the PTA meeting, not just for their child, but for every child in that community. That person, and it's sometimes a family, they are the support system for the community. They are the ones that, I've had a kid running through the hall at a middle school. My office was at Henderson. And I said, boy, stop running through that hall. And I said, every day you running through the hall. He said, you can't tell me what to do. I said, come here. I said, don't let me see you run through this hall again. I'm gonna call your grandmother. He said, you know Big Mama? I said, yeah. He said, don't tell her. He said, don't tell her. I said, I'm your cousin. He said, you my cousin for real? I said, yes, I'm your cousin. I said, if you run through this hall again, I'm gonna snatch you up. You hear me? Yes. He came to my office. All the kids knew I kept popcorn and Pepsis. He'd come to my office, get a Pepsi, come get popcorn. But they said he couldn't pass the SOLs. He passed with one of the highest scores in the school. Some of his teachers said, do you really know him? I said, no. And don't you tell him I'm not his cousin. And so it's about nurturing. It's about caring. I never paid any attention to a hug, a touch on their arm. We know what's missing. We can tell the children that have been beat up and put into the mill, but if we touch them, if we love them from afar and not be afraid to share that, we can make those kids, we'll make the kids who live in the big high-rise house, they'll want to go live in the projects for all that love and attention. And so you make those children do well. You give them, did you know you could stay after school to get some help with this subject? Did you know? Are you gonna be in the building? Yeah, I'm gonna be in the building. And so the boy's mother came to the school and told the secretary she wanted to meet with her cousin. So the secretary said, nobody in here claims these people but Renata, call her. And she thought I was her cousin too, but it was okay. It worked. So you have to talk about the communities we live in, the strength of our communities, and we have never been short on love. Never.
Sister Renata, thank you so much. And from now on, you and I are gonna be cousins.
That's right. Thank you.
But I got some, you put some fire in people's bellies because I got some people who wanna chime in here. Stephanie, go ahead and add your comment, and then we'll take Valerie, and then we'll move on.
So yeah, I really appreciate what Dr. Jones just said. It does take, our communities. It's one reason that I really feel like we need to go back to employing community members in our schools to help us with kids. Someone proposed, why not, bring in auntie or grandma, that person who knows all of those kids, and give them a little money to be in the school and help us with, just talking to them and treating them, like they are the kings and queens that they are. And so, yeah, that's really important. But I do want to add that, respectability politics have never worked for us completely. Now, my son, I raised him extraordinarily carefully. My son does say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. He knows how to dress. He knows how to tie a tie. But one night he had a very minor fender bender and had to go to court. And the state trooper threatened him with a felony. My child, who I raised from the minute he was born to be, the beautiful young man that he is, was threatened with a felony. So we need to recognize too that our justice system is not fair. And that Black males, no matter how yellow they are, because my son is pretty high yellow, have, exponentially more of a chance of being charged with felonies than those who are not Black.
Thank you, Steph. Valerie, and then we're going to move on to Renata.
Very quickly, the question, how do we find those young folks who are doing well and take that model and replicate it? I talked just very, very, very briefly about Rise for Youth, the organization that I'm the director of. And, our prize, our highest achievement is Youth for Rise. That's the young people that we work with out of Richmond who are coming from those same challenged situations, but yet they are young people who are advocating. They are talking to legislators. They are demanding that change is made. They are standing up for the policies that are going to make life better for them. And it's open to every young person in Richmond. And so we are constantly reaching out to the different school divisions and other areas to say, hey, come and be a part of this. And now we have young people who are reaching out to their peers and saying, hey, come and be a part of this. There's something good that you can do. And I tell you, the young folks that we work with, they will call me in the middle of the night and say, hey, so-and-so is in trouble. Will you spend a moment to just talk to me? What can I say? They'll talk to me and say, hey, will you say a prayer for so-and-so because such and such is happening? I'm going to tell you what, when you show yourself to be someone that young people can lean on, trust, and that you are consistently there for them, it's everything that Dr. Renata has already shared, but you know, it's got to extend beyond the classroom, right? And beyond the school building. It's got to be the community that opens itself up and says, I am here for you too. I'm your family too. And so, yeah, I'm one of them aunties and I'm glad to be.
Thank you, Valerie. Bernice?
Yes. Okay, Dr. Monroe, I have a question for you. As professor of criminology, how would you describe the numerous issues that entangle African Americans in the criminal justice system and the lasting impact it has on Black families?
Well, a few things. First, I think what it does is it reinforces the false perception that Black men aren't needed in the homes or the communities in order for Black families to be successful. And of course, we do know there are several homes where we have a single parent and they raise, you know, fantastic children, but those men are still needed. So when the men are not there for various reasons of incarceration, it does give that reinforced thinking that society gives us already about Black men, that they're useless, they're worthless, and they're not needed anywhere in society, particularly in the homes of Black families. And that simply just is not true. Now, when we start to buy into that false reality, we also tend to lose respect for those Black men. When we look at a lot of conversations or even rap music, we hear a lot about the Black mothers. I believe Tupac made the song about his mama called Dear Mama. Well, we don't really hear too many songs or conversations that reinforce the greatness of our Black men, whether they are incarcerated or not, because great is who they all are. But we do not hear that enough. And because we don't hear it enough, it's difficult for us to believe that. When we look at the amount of crimes that are committed by Blacks upon other Black individuals, that is because of the psychological conditioning that they have brought into that Black men particularly aren't worth living. So what is happening there is they don't even realize that they are looking at each other, not through their own eyes, but they're looking at each other through the eyes of society. We see how society views Black people. We've talked about it over and over in this particular symposium when we talk about pretty much that there are two different Americas. We saw what happened at the Capitol, and everybody can definitely agree or not that had those individuals in Black who stormed the Capitol, the outcome would have been different for those individuals. And we've seen that already with the Black Lives Matter protesters, how different the reaction was from those law enforcement officers. Also, another point to the incarceration and the impact it has on Black families is it takes away from the child that vital experience of being loved unconditionally by that missing parent. When that experience isn't there, we also lose out on a bonding experience that parents and children should have. We also lose out on life lessons that parents will have an opportunity to teach their children, moral support that can be given to that child from the parent. All of those things are missing out when we have incarcerated parents. And that is why I'm so glad to hear individuals such as Professor Rizzi, who talks about being a direct advocate. She's working with those individuals who are incarcerated. When we listen to individuals such as Attorney Slater talking about the work that she's doing with our juveniles, right? And then, of course, when we are listening to the lovely Dr. Renata Jones and the work that she's doing with the area of social work, we're all coming together because there is an issue that needs to be tackled in this community, not just talked about, but we need to tackle this issue, find a way to dismantle it, not for the moment, but we need to rid this thing for good. I believe it was Professor Rizzi who said one of the things that needs to happen is we need to change the system. I agree with that 100%, but I would take it a step further and state that we need to go back and create our own system. I think what has happened to us so many times, and a part of it is because of the civil rights marches, when we had to march for certain rights, we are asking for certain rights. It has turned us, believe it or not, into a people who have become beggars. Now we're so used to sitting around and waiting for someone to give us permission to simply be, and that permission will not come. We've had to vote, right? We had to ask for permission to vote. We've had to ask for permission to marry outside of our race. We've had to ask for permission to live in neighborhoods that was predominantly occupied by white people. We had to ask for permission to attend certain schools, again, that was predominantly attended by white students. So now that mindset has caused us to feel like we have to beg and fight and ask or march or whatever you want to call it, you're asking for permission to do. And what is it that we're asking for permission to do? We're simply asking for permission to be. When we talk about things such as Black Lives Matter, for example, we're asking for permission to be. When if you're human, that's your permission in itself. You don't have to ask for somebody to be okay with you jogging, sitting in Starbucks, drinking coffee, sleeping in your bed. You don't have to ask for permission to do that. The problem comes about, once again, when we are looking at each other through the eyes of society, that makes you think that you cannot be of any value unless society says it's okay. We know as long as we're walking around with light skin, dark skin, black skin, whatever your skin is, but when you fill out that application, you say African American. Once we're walking around with that skin, you're not going to get the permission that you're looking for. But if we look back in history and we look at things such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we say today that that is our Black Wall Street, that was a predominantly white neighborhood. And I call it a neighborhood because it had everything that was needed in order for the total people to be successful. They had banks, they had grocery stores, they had homes, they had schools. They did not just have low-income apartments with a chicken house on every block. They did not have a low-income housing development with a liquor store on every block with a great big church, but you also have low-funded schools. That is not a neighborhood, that is not a community. That's just where people are laying their head for the moment. And that does not play a part in the success of our Black men, our Black women, nor our Black children. So the mass incarceration that is happening today, I think it is a direct result of the trauma, as I stated earlier, that is happening in our community. We hear a lot about the prison, the school to prison pipeline. And I've read a lot about that. I've researched, I sat on plenty of panels that talk about it, but I like to take that a step further too. We need to start looking at the household to prison pipeline, because there's some things that's going on in that house that's causing trauma to that child that has nothing to do with white supremacy. When you look at the various types of trauma that is happening, the fact that we know that we have parents who have boyfriends sneaking in the bedroom of their children at night, that has nothing to do with white supremacy. And then when we have situations such as that, to be very specific, when the parent will put the child out of the house in order to keep the predator inside the house, that has nothing to do with white supremacy. And then that has nothing to do with that child being sent to the prison pipeline from the school. What happens is the child is reacting to what happened at home in the school, because outside of the home, the school is where they spend the most time. So if something is happening that is traumatic to that child, the place where they're spending the most time is where that child is going to exhibit those signs and symptoms of trauma. But if in that environment, they do not have the people who are experts in the field of childhood trauma, they're going to mislabel what they see. And now that child is being either in school suspension or out of school, possibly being arrested. And depending on the charge, there might be a direct file, right? Charge them as an adult. It happens so much in the state of Florida. That is where I'm from. As a matter of fact, Florida leads the nation in incarcerating juveniles in adult prisons. That's absolutely insane. But it is a reality for a lot of our children. So when we look at this issue, this devil called mass incarceration, it is causing chaos not only in the homes of our children, but it is causing chaos in the minds of our children. And that is why I am just dedicated to the particular type of research that I'm putting so much time into, because we've got to get the word out that there's some traumatic experiences going on in our Black homes, in the minds of our Black children, and it's causing an abnormal amount of brain development. It's causing their brains to not develop correctly. So when you look at, for example, our children who are experiencing the various types of trauma, one or more, whatever it is, and they're not doing well academically, but they do exceptionally well athletically, that is the different parts of the brain. Because we all know that on the right side, that's the artistic side. That's the side that lends to, doing well when you are an athlete. But the part of the brain that is traumatized because of whatever is happening in the homes or the minds of those kids, that's the left side. So I believe everything that our esteemed panel members are saying, but I believe Dr. Rizzi, she hit it right on the head. We need to not only reevaluate the system, we need to expect change, but the predominant thing that we need to do is we need to create our own system and we need to affect that change.
Thank you, Sister Monica. I'm going to give it back to Bernice, but unfortunately we're out of time, folks, so we're not going to be able to have any follow-up questions. I'm sorry about that. Bernice, do you want to close it out?
Sure. I want to thank all of you. This was really, really a great symposium. This is our third annual symposium dealing with the issues affecting the Black family, the issues affecting the Black community. And I want to thank Dr. Forbes, Daryl Hayart, Stephanie Ritzie. I want to thank Valerie Slater, Dr. Monroe, and Dr. Jones. And we will be coming back again. This is not the last of the webinars we're going to have. We're going to continue discussions. We're going to have conversations again tomorrow evening, and we're asking the audience participants to join us, because tomorrow evening we're going to talk about where do we go from here. We have identified all the issues and pandemics in the Black community, but now we have to solve some of these problems. So we're going to talk about where do we go from here. And I see a lot of questions coming in and thank you all for joining us. We want to also thank Virginia Union University for partnering in this event. We want to thank Living a Dream. That's the program that kicked off the Martin Luther King Community Learning Week, and my organization, the Bernice Travers Foundation. And we're going to continue these discussions. And I want to thank you, Dr. Sean Yusey, for being a moderator. You have always joined us when we have these discussions, and we're going to continue them. We're going to continue them and look forward to getting announcements on a monthly basis, because we're going to have these events on a monthly basis. And again, I want to thank all the panelists, and join us again tomorrow evening when we talk about where do we go from here to address these issues and the pandemic problems that we talked about tonight. And thank you all. Thank you very much, Sean.
Bernice, let's also thank Kevin and Rashida for the excellent.
Yes.
Thank you.
Would you thank them, our Zoom producers?
I did.
And we want to thank Ms. Cosby, who helped put this event on. Okay, from Virginia Union.
Okay.
I'm reading all of the comments. Thank you very much.
You can do anything that you want to. You can do anything. We ride. You can do anything that you want.
And we reach for the sky. When we let spirit soar, we can have so much more.
Now's the time we've been waiting for. No more waiting for someone to open the door. Just like the sun rises at the break of day, we're moving forward with no delay. No more listening to those who tell us to shut up. Not yesterday, nor tomorrow, but today is our time to rise up, rise up, rise.
We rise, and it is no surprise. There's more to life than it seems, and we can live out our dreams.
A new day is dawning on the horizon. And like a phoenix, we keep on rising. Reach up, rise up, head to the skies. Speak up, wise up, eyes on the rise. Insist, resist, and mobilize. You gotta commit, organize. Be positive in how you live, cause you got so much more to give. Like cream that rises to the top. Get up, stand up, never stop, never stop, never stop, never stop. Rise.
We rise, and just realize you can achieve just what you believe.
To be all you wanna be, you gotta know that you can. Go where you want, you need to have a plan. And not only have one, follow it. Pride, swallow it. When you fly, aim high. Don't worry about the landing, you'll succeed beyond your understanding. On your way, don't carry a load. Be the wizard at the end of the road. To have peace, fight the good fight. To find love, soar to higher heights. And once you're up high enough, big issues are small. Yes, you can master it all.
And we would be wise. So there is nothing above the value of my love. Love.